Have you ever been judged by your cover? Sized up in a single glance and dismissed as insignificant? We've all been there. But what happens when that judgment comes from a man who can buy and sell entire city blocks, a man dripping with so much power he thinks the world is his to command? This is the story of Layla, a young waitress drowning in debt and grief, serving tables at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. And this is the story of Alistair Sterling, the billionaire who decided to mock her in a language he was sure she wouldn't understand. He was wrong. And in the space of a few seconds, Layla's perfect, whispered reply would not only shatter his arrogance, but change both of their lives forever. Stay tuned, because you won't believe the twist that comes next. The air in Ethelgard's was a finely tuned instrument. It hummed with the quiet clinking of crystal silverware against bone china, the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals, and the subtle, intoxicating scent of truffle oil and old money. For Layla Nassif, it was the sound of survival. Each perfectly polished wine glass, each meticulously folded napkin, was a step away from the eviction notice taped to the inside of her apartment door. At 24, Layla wore the restaurant's starched black uniform like a suit of armor, but underneath she was fraying at the seams. Her life was a ledger of debts left behind by her mother's long, losing battle with cancer. The medical bills were a mountain, and her job at Ethelgard's was a tiny shovel, chipping away at an impossible peak. She moved through the opulent dining room with a practiced grace, her smile gentle but distant, her eyes the color of warm honey, just like her mother's, holding a deep, scholarly sadness that none of the patrons ever noticed. They saw a waitress, a pair of hands to refill their water, a silent figure to clear their plates. They didn't see the woman who, just 2 years ago, was the most promising doctoral candidate in the Near Eastern Languages Department at Columbia University. They didn't see the girl who grew up reading ancient Akkadian texts with her mother, Dr. Layla Nassif, a world-renowned linguist whose Beirut apartment had been filled with the scent of cardamom coffee and dusty manuscripts. They didn't know that the language of Gilgamesh was as familiar to her as the daily specials Chef Antoine scribbled on the kitchen chalkboard. Tonight, the air in Ethelgard's felt heavier than usual. A thick, expectant tension coiled around a corner booth. Table 7. It was the best table in the house, a secluded alcove of dark leather and polished mahogany that offered a commanding view of the entire room. And tonight it was occupied by the Titan himself, Alistair Sterling. Sterling wasn't just wealthy, he was a force of nature, a real estate mogul whose name was blazoned in gold on half the skyscrapers that clawed at the New York skyline. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a perpetually tanned, imperious face. His suit was a custom-tailored masterpiece of dark grey wool that probably cost more than Layla's entire student loan debt. He radiated an aura of impatient, absolute power. With him was a younger man, Marcus Vance, a vice president in Sterling's empire. Vance was a carbon copy in training, all sharp angles and sycophantic smiles, hanging on his boss's every word. He laughed too loudly when Sterling made a dry remark and nodded vigorously at every pronouncement. "It's the Al-Fahim deal," Maria, the restaurant's sharp-eyed manager, had whispered to Layla during the pre-shift briefing. "He's trying to secure funding for his new Hudson Yards project from a Saudi sovereign wealth fund. He's been on edge for weeks." That was an understatement. From the moment he sat down, Sterling was a storm cloud ready to burst. He'd sent back his martini because the olive was insufficiently chilled. He'd sneered at the bread basket. Every interaction was a test, a power play designed to remind everyone in his orbit of their place. It was Layla's turn to serve their main course. She balanced the heavy silver tray, the muscles in her arm taut. On it were 2 plates, a Wagyu steak, seared to a precise medium rare for Sterling, and a pan-seared branzino for Vance. She approached the table with the quiet, unobtrusive confidence Maria had drilled into her. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice soft but clear. She placed his steak before him. As she leaned over to place Vance's fish, her hand, weary from a 10-hour shift, trembled for a fraction of a second. The corner of the heavy porcelain plate ticked against a water glass. It was a minuscule sound, barely audible over the restaurant's hum, but in the gravitational field of Alistair Sterling's ego, it was a seismic event. He stopped mid-sentence, his cold blue eyes fixing on her. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his lips. He looked at Marcus, then back at Layla, dismissing her as if she were a piece of faulty furniture. Then, leaning back in his seat, he switched to a fluid, Gulf-accented Arabic, a language he'd picked up doing business in Dubai and Riyadh. "Unzur ila hadhihi al-miskina," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at this poor thing." Marcus, who knew a few phrases from his own business trips, chuckled obsequiously. Sterling continued, his gaze still on Layla, enjoying the public display of his own cleverness, his power to speak in a code he believed made him invisible. "يعدها ترتجفا لا تكاد تحميل الطباق ربما هذا أكبر طموح فعن حياتها أن لا تسكت شريحة لحم." Her hands are shaking. She can barely hold the plate. This is probably the biggest ambition of her life, not to drop a piece of meat. The words, spoken in the beautiful lyrical tongue of her mother, felt like stones being thrown at her. Each syllable was a fresh wound layered on old grief. This was the language her mother had used to sing her lullabies, to recite the poetry of Al-Mutanabbi, to explain the intricate beauty of the world. And this man, this callous, arrogant man, was using it to strip her of her dignity, piece by piece, right in front of her. A hot, familiar shame washed over her. The shame of the unpaid bills, of the pawned family jewelry, of the PhD gown she'd never get to wear. Her first instinct was to shrink, to become invisible, to absorb the insult and retreat into the shadows of the dining room. But then, something else stirred. A deeper, older part of her. The echo of her mother's voice, firm and proud. "Layla, your mind is your fortress. No one can conquer it unless you lower the gate." She straightened her back, the heavy silver tray suddenly feeling weightless in her hand. She did not look at Alistair Sterling. She looked past him, at a point on the far wall, and drew a slow, deliberate breath. The hum of the restaurant faded away. There was only the thumping of her own heart and the echo of her mother's legacy. For a long moment, Layla stood perfectly still, a silent statue in the whirlwind of Alistair Sterling's arrogance. The insult hung in the air between them, a foul, invisible smoke. Sterling watched her, a predatory gleam in his eye, waiting for her to scurry away, flustered and defeated. Marcus Vance was still smirking, already mentally replaying the story for his colleagues back at the office. To them, the exchange was over. The billionaire had made his point. The little waitress had been put in her place. But Layla wasn't retreating. She was gathering herself. She was reaching back through the years of grief and hardship, back to sun-drenched afternoons in Beirut, to the scent of jasmine and old books, to the sound of her mother's voice patiently correcting her pronunciation of a complex, classical Arabic phrase. Dr. Lena Nassif had not raised a daughter to be cowed by ignorant men, no matter how rich they were. Layla slowly lowered her gaze from the far wall and met Alistair Sterling's eyes directly. Her own honey-coloured eyes, which a moment ago had been clouded with weariness, were now sharp and clear as polished glass. There was no anger in them. There was no fear. There was only a profound, crystalline stillness that was far more unsettling. And then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was a near whisper, so quiet that Sterling and Vance had to lean in slightly to hear it. But it cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a surgeon's scalpel. She didn't use the modern, colloquial Arabic Sterling had used. She responded in the pure, formal, and devastatingly elegant language of scholars and poets, classical Arabic, a form so refined that many native speakers struggled with its complexities. Al-karamu an takuna kariman, ma man yuhsinu ilayk, she began, her pronunciation flawless, the guttural consonants and soft vowels flowing from her lips like water. The phrase was simple, yet profound. Generosity is to be generous to those who are good to you. She paused, holding Sterling's stunned gaze. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Layla continued, her voice gaining a quiet, unshakable strength. وَلَكِنَ الْفَضْلُ الْحَقَّاقِ هُوَ أَن تَكُونَ كَرْمًا مَعَ مَنْ أَسَاءَ إِلَيْكَ. But true nobility is to be generous to the one who has wronged you. It was not a direct retort. It was not an insult. It was a lesson in ethics, a philosophical rebuke delivered with the precision of an academic. It was a line her mother had often quoted, a reminder that grace was a choice, especially in the face of ugliness. By using it, Layla was doing more than just showing she understood. She was elevating the conversation to a plane Sterling couldn't reach. She was exposing his brutishness not by sinking to his level, but by rising far, far above it. She held his gaze for one more second, letting the weight of her words settle into the sudden, suffocating silence at the table. Then, with a calm, deliberate poise that was the very antithesis of the shaking hands he had mocked, she placed Marcus Vance's branzino on the table without a single sound. She straightened up, her posture regal. In her simple black uniform, she suddenly possessed more dignity than the two men in their $1,000 suits combined. Finally, she delivered the killing blow. Still in that same perfect classical tongue, she added a final, polite, and utterly shattering sentence. Atamana lakum wajbatan shahia. I wish you a pleasant meal. And with that, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured and silent. She disappeared into the controlled chaos of the service area, leaving a crater of stunned silence in her wake. At table 7, the world had tilted on its axis. The sound of a heavy, silver fork falling from Alistair Sterling's nerveless fingers and clattering against his porcelain plate was like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. Marcus Vance's mouth was still hanging open, his face a comical picture of shock and confusion. He looked at his boss, expecting an explosion, a command to fire the girl on the spot. But Alistair Sterling didn't move. He stared at the spot where Layla had stood, his face ashen. The tan he so carefully cultivated couldn't hide the pale shock underneath. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been publicly, intellectually, and morally disarmed. He had used a language as a weapon, assuming his target was defenseless, only to find she was a master swordsman who had turned his blade back on him with effortless grace. He hadn't just been answered back. He had been judged, and he had been found wanting. The taste of his expensive Wagyu steak, which he had so desperately craved moments before, had turned to ash in his mouth. Layla walked through the swinging kitchen doors, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice now threatened to give out, leaving her knees weak. She leaned against the cool stainless steel wall, drawing in a shaky breath that smelled of garlic and roasting duck. Did I just do that? The question screamed in her mind. Did I really just quote classical Arabic philosophy to Alastair Sterling? The immediate fear was overwhelming. She would be fired. Of course she would be fired. A man like Sterling wouldn't tolerate being embarrassed. He would have Maria dismiss her before his dessert course arrived. The thought of losing this job, her only lifeline, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The mountain of debt seemed to grow taller, more menacing. Chef Antoine, a formidable Frenchman with a fiery temper and a passion for perfection, was plating a delicate tower of seared scallops. He glanced up, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Nassif, you look like you have seen a ghost." Before Layla could answer, the kitchen doors swung open again. It was Maria, her expression a tight mask of professional concern. "Layla, my office. Now." This is it, Layla thought, her stomach plummeting. She followed Maria, her worn-out work shoes feeling heavy as lead. The staff parted for them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The incident at Table 7 had not gone unnoticed. Whispers were already darting through the restaurant like hummingbirds. Maria's office was a small, cluttered space that was the nerve center of Ethelgard's. She closed the door and gestured for Layla to sit. Maria sat behind her desk, her hands folded, her gaze intense. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, her voice even. Layla recounted the story, her voice faltering slightly as she repeated Sterling's cruel words. She then told Maria her response, translating the Arabic phrases. As she spoke, she expected Maria's face to harden with disapproval, to hear a lecture about professionalism and knowing one's place. Instead, Maria's expression softened into something Layla had never seen before, a look of fierce, unadulterated pride. "My God, Layla," Maria breathed, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Good for you." Layla stared at her, bewildered. "You're not going to fire me?" Maria laughed, a rich, throaty sound. "Fire you? Honey, you are the best waitress I have. You're punctual, you're meticulous, and you never complain. That man, Alastair Sterling, he comes in here and treats my staff like dirt because he thinks his money gives him the right. What you didn't insult him. You didn't cause a scene. You simply held a mirror up to his own ugliness. If he wants to complain, let him. Let him try to explain to me that he's upset because the waitress understood the insults he was throwing at her in a foreign language. I'd love to hear him try." A wave of relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Layla. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, the first she'd allowed herself to shed in months. Maria reached across the desk and patted her hand. "You are worth 10 of him, Layla. Don't you ever forget that. Now, wash your face. I'm putting you on the dessert service for the ambassador's table. They're much nicer." Meanwhile, back in the dining room, the atmosphere at Table 7 was glacial. Sterling had barely touched his steak. Marcus Vance, after several failed attempts to start a conversation, had fallen into a cowed silence, picking at his fish. The power dynamic between them had been irrevocably shattered. Vance had witnessed his invincible boss be intellectually flawed by a waitress, and the awe he once held for the man had been replaced by a new, uncomfortable awareness of his vulnerability. Sterling couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head. True nobility is to be generous to the one who has wronged you. The words echoed, mocking him. It wasn't just that she understood. It was the way she had responded, the precision, the elegance, the sheer, unassailable dignity of it. She hadn't just learned a few phrases, she was fluent, deeply fluent. Who was she? He felt a hot flush of shame, a foreign and deeply unpleasant emotion. He had built an empire on his ability to read people, to find their weaknesses and exploit them. Yet he had looked at that young woman and seen nothing. He had dismissed her as a non-entity, a piece of the scenery, and in doing so had exposed a profound ignorance within himself. Without another word, he threw his napkin onto the table. "We're leaving." "But Mr. Sterling—" "The deal," Marcus stammered. "We were going to discuss the Al-Fahim presentation." "The evening is ruined," Sterling snapped, his voice a low growl. He stood up, threw a black credit card onto the table, and stalked towards the exit without a backward glance. He didn't want dessert. He didn't want coffee. He wanted to be as far away from Ethelgard's and the penetrating gaze of his waitress as possible. As he stormed out onto the cool New York street, the shame began to curdle into something else, an obsessive, burning curiosity. He was a man who solved problems. He was a man who hated loose ends and unanswered questions. And the waitress, with her honey-colored eyes and poet's tongue, was the most compelling mystery he had stumbled upon in years. He wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. The following morning, Alistair Sterling was not in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park. He was in his private study, a room lined with dark wood and first-edition books he'd never read. The Al-Fahim proposal, a multi-billion-dollar project that had consumed him for months, lay untouched on his desk. He was on the phone, not with his board of directors, but with a man named Robert Finlay. Finlay was a discreet and ruthlessly efficient private investigator. He was the man Sterling called when he needed to vet a new business partner, find leverage in a negotiation, or, in this case, satisfy a burning obsession. "I need to know everything about a woman," Sterling said, his voice clipped and devoid of its usual booming confidence. "Her name is Layla. She's a waitress at Ethelgard's on the Upper East Side. I don't have a last name." "Ethelgard's," Finlay repeated, his tone flat. "That specific? Age? Description?" Sterling described her as best he could, focusing on the details that were now seared into his memory. The quiet poise, the intelligent eyes, the way she had held herself. He omitted the reason for his interest, of course. He framed it as a security concern, a background check on restaurant staff, a lie so flimsy it was almost transparent. Finlay, a professional, asked no further questions. "I'll have something for you by end of day," the investigator promised. The hours crawled by. Sterling found himself unable to focus. He snapped at his assistant, cancelled 3 meetings, and paced his study like a caged panther. The woman's face, her voice, the calm superiority in her eyes, it all haunted him. His world was built on a simple hierarchy. He was at the top, and people like her were at the bottom. She had taken that simple, comforting structure and upended it. He felt an urgent, primal need to understand how. Late in the afternoon, an encrypted email from Finlay arrived. The subject line was a single word. "Nassif." Sterling opened the file, and his world tilted once again. The first page was a standard background check. Layla Nassif, age 24. No criminal record, a string of service jobs for the past 2 years, currently residing in a small, walk-up apartment in Queens, a mountain of outstanding medical debt from St. Vincent's Hospital, linked to a deceased patient, Dr. Lena Nassif. The name hit him first. Dr. Lena Nassif. He knew that name. A few years ago, when he was in the early stages of courting investors in the Gulf, his advisors had recommended he hire a cultural consultant. Dr. Nassif's name had been at the top of every list. She was described as the preeminent Western scholar on Semitic languages and Middle Eastern culture, a brilliant academic from a prestigious Lebanese family who had taught at Columbia for 30 years. He had tried to hire her, but his secretary had reported back that Dr. Nassif was on an indefinite medical leave. He'd forgotten all about it. Until now, he scrolled down, his heart beginning to pound. The file contained Layla's academic records, unearthed from Columbia University's archives, a perfect 4.00 GPA, a full scholarship, accepted into the doctoral program at the age of 21. Her specialization, comparative poetics in ancient and modern Arabic. Her dissertation advisor's notes called her a once-in-a-generation talent, a mind that possessed her mother's brilliance, combined with an even more intuitive grasp of linguistic nuance. Then came the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. 2 years ago, Layla Nassif had withdrawn from the program, citing a family emergency. The date of her withdrawal was 1 week after her mother, Dr. Lena Nassif, had passed away, leaving her daughter as the sole heir to a crushing load of medical debt accrued during a brutal, uninsured fight against pancreatic cancer. Alistair Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs in a hiss. The shaking hands he had mocked were not from fear or incompetence, they were from exhaustion. The poor thing, whose greatest ambition was not to drop a plate, was, in fact, a scholar of staggering intellect, a young woman who had sacrificed her own brilliant future to care for her dying mother. The woman he had tried to humiliate with a few crude, marketplace Arabic phrases was an expert in the very soul of the language. The shame he'd felt the night before returned, but this time it was 100 times more potent, a physical sickness that churned in his gut. He saw his own reflection in the polished surface of his desk, the face of an arrogant, cruel old fool. He had mocked a grieving daughter for her poverty, a poverty that was the direct result of her devotion. He had belittled a scholar for serving him food, when her mind likely contained more beauty and wisdom than he could ever hope to acquire. The Al-Fahim deal. The reason for all his stress, the reason he had been so vile. The deal hinged on bridging a cultural gap, on showing a deep respect for the Saudi investor's heritage and traditions. He and his team had been stumbling through it, relying on translated documents and generic cultural briefings. And all along, the perfect key to unlock the entire partnership, a woman with a profound, authentic understanding of their world, had been standing right in front of him, and he had been too blind and too arrogant to see anything but a waitress. The irony was so bitter, it was almost comical. He closed the file. His usual playbook in a situation like this would be to write a check, to send an expensive gift, to smooth things over with money. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wouldn't work this time. Layla Nassif was not a problem money could simply solve. You couldn't buy forgiveness from someone who possessed that kind of quiet, unshakable dignity. He had to face her. He had to apologize, but even more than that, a new, audacious idea was beginning to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a crazy, improbable gambit. But Alistair Sterling had built his empire on audacious gambits, and this one felt more important than any skyscraper he had ever built. 2 days later, Layla was in the middle of the pre-dinner rush, polishing wine glasses until they gleamed under the soft lights. She had been walking on eggshells since the incident, half expecting Alistair Sterling to appear at any moment, flanked by lawyers, to demand her termination. But the days had passed in a strange, tense quiet. The staff at Ethelgard's now treated her with a new level of respect, a quiet admiration in their eyes. Chef Antoine had even started saving her a small portion of his staff meal cassoulet, a gesture of approval more valuable than any verbal praise. The front-of-house door opened, and Maria walked towards her, her expression unreadable. "Layla, you have a visitor." Layla's heart sank. "Is it Mr. Sterling?" "Yes," Maria said, her lips a thin line. He's not at a table. He's in the foyer. He specifically asked to speak with you privately for 5 minutes. He looks different." "Different how?" Layla asked, her hands suddenly clammy. "Humble," Maria said, as if the word itself tasted strange. "It doesn't suit him. The choice is yours. You don't have to see him. I can tell him to leave." Layla considered it. Her first instinct was to say no, to protect the fragile peace she had found. But then she thought of her mother. Lena Nassif had never shied away from difficult conversations. She had believed in facing things head-on. "No," Layla said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'll speak with him." She took off her apron, smoothed down her uniform, and walked from the warm, bustling dining room into the cool, quiet marble of the foyer. Alistair Sterling was standing by the window, looking out at the stream of yellow cabs on the street. He wasn't wearing one of his power suits. He was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and trousers. As Maria had said, he looked different. The arrogant, imperious mask was gone. In its place was a man who looked weary, older, and deeply uncomfortable. He turned as she approached, and for the first time, he looked her in the eye without a trace of condescension. "Miss Nassif," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Thank you for seeing me." Layla simply nodded, her arms crossed, waiting. She would not make this easy for him. He seemed to struggle for words, a rare state for a man used to commanding boardrooms. "I came here to apologize," he said finally. "What I said to you the other night was inexcusable. It was cruel, arrogant, and I am profoundly ashamed of my behavior." He paused, but Layla remained silent. An apology was a start, but it couldn't erase the sting of his words. "I did some research," Sterling continued, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. "I learned about your mother, Dr. Lena Nassif. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. She was a brilliant woman. And I learned about your own academic work, about what you sacrificed." Layla's posture stiffened. He had looked into her life. The violation of it, the intrusion, sent a spark of anger through her. "You had me investigated." "I did," he admitted, meeting her eyes again. There was no apology for that, only a statement of fact. "I had to understand. And now I do. I understand that I didn't just insult a waitress. I insulted a scholar, a devoted daughter, a woman of extraordinary character who was facing circumstances I can't even imagine. My behavior was not just rude. It was a desecration of your mother's memory and your sacrifice. For that, I have no words to express my regret." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. He wasn't performing. He was confessing. Layla felt a fraction of her anger dissipate, replaced by a weary confusion. What did he want? "Apology accepted, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone cool and formal. "Is there anything else?" She wanted this to be over. "Yes," he said, taking a step closer. "There is. This is going to sound opportunistic, and perhaps it is, but it is also sincere. Miss Nassif, I am in the final stages of a negotiation for a project that will define my legacy. It is with the Al Fahim Sovereign Wealth Fund. The deal has been stalling for months, and I've just realized why. My team and I, we don't truly understand our partners. We speak their language in business terms, but we don't understand the culture, the nuance, the poetry behind it. We've been clumsy, disrespectful, in our own way." He took a deep breath. "You, Miss Nassif, you possess an understanding that is deep, authentic, and intuitive. It's in your blood. It's in your mind. It's what your mother embodied." Layla stared at him, her mind racing as she began to see where this was going. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he said, his voice filled with a new, urgent energy. "I am asking for your expertise. I want to hire you. Not as a waitress, but as a lead cultural and linguistic consultant for Sterling Enterprises on the Alpha Him project. I want you to advise my team, to vet our communications, to sit in on our negotiations. I want you to be the bridge that we have failed to build." He named a salary that made Layla's head spin. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of, enough to settle her mother's debts in a single stroke and live comfortably for years. "Furthermore," he added, pressing his advantage, "as part of your compensation package, Sterling Enterprises will provide a full grant to fund the completion of your PhD at Columbia, with a living stipend included. You can finish your dissertation. You can fulfill the legacy your mother saw for you." It was an impossible offer. It was a golden key that would unlock every door that had been slammed shut in her face. It was freedom. It was the restoration of her life's dream. And it was being offered by the man who, just 2 nights ago, had tried to crush her spirit for his own amusement. Layla looked at Alistair Sterling, at the desperate hope in his eyes. He didn't just want to hire her. He needed her. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was a business proposition, born of his own colossal failure. Her mind, the very thing he had belittled, was now the asset he needed most. The irony was so thick she could taste it. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt vindicated. But all she felt was a profound, complicated turmoil. Could she work for him? Could she take the hand of the man who had wounded her so deeply, even if that hand offered her everything she had lost? "I need to think about it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," Sterling said immediately, nodding. "Take all the time you need." He pulled a card from his pocket. It was his private number. "My offer is unconditional and will not change. I hope you'll consider it." He turned and left Ethelgard's, leaving Layla standing alone in the marble foyer, holding a small piece of cardboard that represented the most difficult and important decision of her life. Layla did not go back to polishing glasses. The world had shifted too dramatically. She found Maria, explained the situation in a daze, and asked for the rest of the night off. Maria, her eyes wide with astonishment, simply nodded and told her to go. She didn't go home. Instead, she took the subway to Morningside Heights, the familiar journey to Columbia University, feeling like a pilgrimage to a past life. She walked through the iron gates, past the statue of Alma Mater, and sat on the cold stone steps of the low memorial library, a place where she had spent countless happy hours with her mother. The air was crisp, and the sky was a deep, starless indigo. She pulled Sterling's card from her pocket and stared at it. The offer was a lifeline, a miracle. It was everything she wanted. But it was tangled up in the memory of humiliation. Accepting it felt like a transaction, as if her dignity had a price tag, and Sterling had finally met it. She closed her eyes and thought about her mother. What would Lena have done? Dr. Nassif was a woman of immense pride, but she was also a pragmatist. She believed that knowledge and skill were tools, and they were meant to be used. She had always told Layla, never let someone else's bitterness poison your own well. If an opportunity arises, even from a flawed source, examine the opportunity, not the source. Was this an opportunity? Or was it a gilded cage, a way for Sterling to assuage his guilt by owning the person he had wronged? The decision crystallized slowly, not as a surrender, but as a strategy. She would not be his charity case. She would not be the repentant billionaire's pet project. If she did this, it would be on her terms. She would be his superior in the one area that mattered, and he would acknowledge it every single day. The next morning, she did not call the number on the card. She knew that a phone call would put her at a disadvantage. Instead, she used a small fraction of her meager savings. She went to a modest consignment shop and bought a simple, elegant navy blue dress. She had her hair styled. She put on the simple pearl earrings that had been her mother's. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a weary waitress. She saw Dr. Lena Nassif's daughter. She took a cab to Stirling Tower, a gleaming monument to its owner's ego. She walked into the marble lobby, her head held high, and announced to the receptionist, "I'm Layla Nassif. I have a meeting with Mr. Stirling." There was no meeting scheduled, of course, but her name now carried weight. Within minutes, a flustered assistant was escorting her up a private elevator to the penthouse floor. Alistair Stirling was in his office when his assistant announced her. He stood up so quickly his chair almost tipped over. He was visibly stunned to see her there, in his domain, looking so composed and powerful. "Miss Nassif," he stammered. I wasn't expecting you." "I don't work for you yet, Mr. Stirling," Layla said, her voice calm and steady. "I don't operate on your schedule. I operate on mine." She walked to the visitors' chairs in front of his massive desk, but didn't sit. She remained standing, forcing him to meet her on an equal level. "I have considered your offer," she said, "and I have my answer. I will accept the position under a specific set of conditions." Stirling was silent, his expression a mixture of surprise and dawning respect. "First," Layla began, "the financial arrangements you proposed are acceptable. The salary, the funding for my doctorate. However, the funds for my mother's medical debt will not be a gift. They will be a zero-interest loan from the company, which I will repay from my salary over the first 5 years of my employment. My mother's honor is not for sale." Stirling blinked, clearly taken aback, but he nodded slowly. "Agreed. Second, my title will not be consultant. My title will be Director of Cultural and Linguistic Strategy. I will report directly to you and only to you. My department will have veto power over any external communications or negotiation tactics related to the Al-Fahim partnership. My decisions in these matters will be final." This was a direct challenge to his authority. Layla could see the flicker of his old arrogance, the instinct to refuse. But she also saw the pragmatist in him, the man who knew he was out of his depth. "Agreed," he said again, his voice tight. "Third," she said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel, "you and I will have a weekly meeting. In that meeting, you will not just be my boss, you will be my student. I will be teaching you what my mother taught me. That culture is not a commodity to be bought or a tool to be used. It is the soul of a people, and you will learn to respect it." She let that final condition hang in the air. This was her price, not money, not power, but his humility. A long silence stretched between them. Alistair Stirling, the titan of industry, was being dictated terms by the young woman he had mocked just a few days ago. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he saw not just the solution to his business problem, but a path to some form of redemption. He saw the strength he had mistaken for weakness, the brilliance he had been too ignorant to recognize. He extended his hand across the vast expanse of his desk. "I agree to all your terms, Miss Nassif," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a note of genuine, unadulterated admiration. "When can you start?" Layla looked at his outstretched hand. She took it, her grip firm and sure. "I can start," she said, "as soon as my contract is drafted by your lawyers, and I will be reviewing it personally." A slow smile touched Alistair Stirling's lips. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just made the best deal of his entire career. 6 weeks after she had accepted Alistair Sterling's astonishing offer, Layla Nassif walked into the main boardroom on the penthouse floor of Sterling Tower. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and simmering anxiety. A dozen of Sterling's top executives, men who navigated the cutthroat world of New York real estate like sharks in a feeding frenzy, were seated around the vast mahogany table. Today, they were adrift, their usual predatory confidence replaced by a nervous uncertainty. They were about to face Sheikh Khalid Al-Fahim, and their entire playbook had been thrown out the window. Layla entered this sea of tension not as an intruder, but as its conductor. Gone was the consignment shop dress, replaced by a bespoke suit, the color of slate gray that radiated quiet authority. Her hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, and in her hands she held not a silver tray, but a leather-bound portfolio containing the new soul of their billion-dollar proposal. At the head of the table, Alistair Sterling gave her a single, affirmative nod. The past month and a half had been a revelation for him. Their weekly lessons, as Layla had insisted on calling them, had become the focal point of his schedule. At first, he had been a reluctant student, bristling at the idea of being taught. But Layla had come armed not with business manuals, but with the books her mother had loved. She used the epic tale of Gilgamesh to teach him about the search for legacy. She read him the poetry of Rumi to explain the nuance of a culture that valued the heart as much as the mind. She showed him how the intricate geometric patterns in Islamic art reflected a worldview that sought harmony and order. Slowly, painstakingly, she had deconstructed his hammer-and-nail philosophy, replacing it with something more complex and far more powerful. "The final presentation is on your tablets," Layla announced, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the nervous chatter. "But the document is not the strategy. The strategy is in this room. It's in how we conduct ourselves." Marcus Vance, who still looked at Layla with a mixture of resentment and fear, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Director," he said, the title tasting like acid in his mouth. "We've spent a year on financial modeling and growth projections. Are we just supposed to ignore that and talk about poetry?" A few of the other executives shifted, the same doubt flickering in their eyes. Layla met Vance's gaze without flinching. "Not at all, Mr. Vance," she replied evenly. "Your numbers are the steel that makes the bridge strong. But steel alone is just a raw material. It cannot span a great distance without a design, without an understanding of the ground on both sides of the chasm. The poetry, the history, the respect, that is the design. We are not abandoning your work. We are giving it a context in which it can finally be understood and appreciated by our partners." She paused, letting her words sink in. "They are not just investing in a building. They are investing in a legacy. We must show them we are worthy custodians of that legacy." Silence. Marcus Vance leaned back, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just defeat, in his eyes. Alistair Sterling watched the exchange, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. He had made the right choice. The following day, the atmosphere was electric. Sheikh Khalid Al-Fahim and his delegation arrived, a group of dignified men in immaculate traditional dress. The Sterling executives stood stiffly, their new lessons warring with old habits. Sterling himself, however, was a different man. He was calm, centered, and he let Layla lead. Following her meticulously choreographed plan, he didn't launch into a business pitch. He greeted the sheikh warmly, and, in the slightly clumsy but respectful Arabic Layla had coached him on, he began by inquiring after the sheikh's family. He then made a knowledgeable comment about a recent acquisition by the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, a topic Layla had researched. The Sheikh's formal demeanor softened, a flicker of surprise and pleasure in his eyes. The tension in the room eased by a crucial degree. When the time came for introductions, Sterling turned not to his lead architect or his CFO, but to Layla. "Sheikh Al-Fahim," he said, his voice resonating with newfound sincerity. "Before we proceed, I would like to introduce the most important member of our team, without whom this meeting would not be possible. This is our Director of Cultural and Linguistic Strategy, Miss Layla Nassif." The Sheikh, a stately man with a scholar's gaze, turned his full attention to Layla. In formal, eloquent Arabic, a dialect of beautiful complexity, he said, "It is an honor to meet you, Miss Nassif. It is a rare and welcome surprise to see a firm of this nature place such importance on the foundations of our culture." Layla inclined her head respectfully, her heart steady, her mind clear. The moment was here. She replied in the same flawless, classical tongue, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the masculine energy in the room. "The honor is all mine, Sheikh Al-Fahim. For as the great poet Al-Mutanabbi wrote, the horse, the night, and the desert know me. A true partnership requires that we truly know one another. My mother, Dr. Layla Nassif, taught me that wisdom." At the mention of her mother's name, the Sheikh's posture changed entirely. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with recognition and warmth. "Dr. Layla Nassif, the brilliant scholar from Columbia. It cannot be. I had the great privilege of attending one of her lectures in London years ago. She spoke of the Umayyad poets with a passion that brought them to life. She was a giant. Her loss was a loss to the entire world of letters. To find her daughter here, this is a blessing." In that instant, the negotiation was transformed. It was no longer a transaction between a Saudi fund and an American corporation. It became a conversation, a meeting of minds, a connection forged through the shared respect for a beloved scholar. Layla was no longer just a director. She was a legacy, a living link to a woman the Sheikh deeply admired. Later, when a difficult point in the contract arose concerning naming rights and cultural representation within the project, the lawyers began to posture. Layla quietly intervened. She spoke to the Sheikh, not of legal clauses, but of the Alhambra in Spain, explaining how its beauty was a testament to a culture that engraved its identity and faith into its architecture. She proposed a solution that enshrined their cultural legacy into the very fabric of the building, a solution far more meaningful than any simple name on a wall. The Sheikh agreed instantly, his face beaming. The deal was done. As the delegation departed hours later, the contract signed, and a genuine warmth established, Alistair Sterling stood beside Layla at the great window overlooking the city. "My father was a construction foreman from Queens," he said softly, his gaze distant. "He was a hard man. He always told me to be the hammer, never the nail. For 40 years, that's all I've been. I hammered my way to the top of this city. When I saw you that night in the restaurant, I saw a nail, and I acted accordingly." He turned to face her, his eyes holding a profound, weary clarity. "What you taught me, Layla, what your mother's books taught me, is that the world isn't just made of hammers and nails. The most important things, the things that last, are bridges, and I spent my whole life breaking things instead of connecting them. You didn't just save this deal. You may have just saved whatever is left of my soul." Layla looked out at the sprawling metropolis, a landscape of steel and glass that had once seemed so intimidating. She thought of her mother, of the crushing debt, of the long, dark nights where hope felt like a foreign country. Her journey had been forged in the fire of humiliation, but from those ashes she had risen, not for revenge, but for restoration. She had honored her mother's legacy, not by staying in the hallowed halls of academia, but by bringing that wisdom into the world, into the very heart of power, and using it to build something new. My mother always believed that words were for building, not for breaking, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable peace. I think she would be happy to know we're finally in the same business, Mr. Sterling. In the gleaming reflection of the boardroom window, she saw not just a titan of industry and his brilliant director, but two very different people who had found common ground. She had found her future, and he, in the twilight of his career, had found a new way to build. And so, Layla's story isn't just about a clever comeback. It's a powerful reminder that there is incredible strength in the places we least expect it. It shows us that a person's worth is not defined by their uniform, their job, or their bank account, but by the knowledge they carry, the character they possess, and the dignity they refuse to surrender. Alistair Sterling looked at a waitress and saw a target. He was forced to see a teacher who would change his life and his legacy. It reminds us all to look deeper, to act with kindness, and to never, ever underestimate the person standing across from you. If this story moved you, please give this video a like. It really helps our channel grow. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the quiet heroes and incredible twists of fate that happen all around us every single day. Thank you for listening.